In this video, I'm going to be going over 30 of the best prospects from China and also just the prospects that I believe are the closest to signing to the UFC. And there's a lot of reasons why the UFC would want to sign fighters from China, and the main one really being a lot of people do live in China. I believe more than 1 billion people live in that country itself, and it's not really a market that they're fully tapped into yet. It's something that they're trying to tap into. In the past, they've done a lot of events in China. They've got a Shanghai UFC Performance Institute. They've got a Chinese champion in Zhang Li. They're about to have a Chinese contender fighting Zhang Li if Zhang Li does manage to beat Amanda Lemos. There's a lot of reasons for the UFC want to sign fighters from China, and the MMA guru actually did bring it up. A lot of people live in China, but there's not a lot of Chinese fighters in the UFC. However, this very much really could be changed somewhat easily because there's so many good fighters from China fighting in JCK and WLF, fighting in these Chinese tournaments that they put on, and where the best of fighters on these tournaments rise to the top, and the worst do rise to the bottom. The guys that have risen to the top are obviously in this list. And the first one is Li Kai-wen. He's 11-5. He's fought for one championship in the past when he was very, very young, and he's now in the Road to UFC tournament this year. He is my pick to win the entire thing at 145 pounds. His probably toughest test is Xiao Li, who is also in this list as well. However, I picked him to win the whole 145 pound tournament. He absolutely dominated Lu Kai in his return fight, first fight since 2021, after he was cut from one, where he was actually meant to sign to the UFC if he won that fight, but he didn't. So he took some time off. Now he's in the Road to UFC tournament. I believe that Li Kai-wen is going to be in the UFC very, very soon. I think this guy's a great fighter. He's a fun fighter, interesting personality, very interesting backstory if you look into it too much. However, with that being said, I'm going to move on to Zhifei Shang. I like Zhifei Shang a lot, actually. He's 37 years old, which is a big reason why the UFC wouldn't want to sign him. However, this guy's like 26-1 in his last 27 fights, which is absolutely ridiculous. In 2016, this guy was 12-7, and now he is 38-8. This guy has won 26 fights and lost one fight in the last 7 years. That is absolutely ridiculous. I think he should be picked up by the UFC. I don't really understand why he wouldn't be picked up by the UFC. I understand how old he is, but you are not going to find this level of experience at 125 pounds, even if you did just use him to test young up-and-coming guys. I think he genuinely would be a good signing, even though he is very, very old for the weight class. The next one is Xiao Li. He will eventually fight Li Kai-wen in the Road to UFC tournament. He's 23-4. Really good featherweight prospect. He could have been signed to the UFC off that loss to Zhang Li in the Road to UFC finals, but decided to not take the loser's contract. And now he's going back into the Road to UFC tournament. He just beat Wujiabeki Jiahefu, and I do believe that he is going to make it all the way to the finals in this tournament. I think Xiao Li is a great fighter. He's mainly a grappler, 26 years old with a record of 23-4. It's pretty crazy. And now we will move on to the next one, Zhu Rong. He's actually been in the UFC before, but he's 23 years old. I think he's probably going to win the whole thing at lightweight in the lightweight Road to UFC tournament. He just went out there, beat Sung Chang Hong with a first round KO. Looked really good, looked a lot more improved over his wins in the UFC and his fights in the UFC and his win after the UFC. I think Zhu Rong is a guy that's in the Road to UFC tournament right now that can make it all the way afterwards. The next fight is going to be the winner of actually Ali Mulatbiyeki and Aziz Kadyrov. Now, Aziz Kadyrov was actually born in Tajikistan, but for some reason Tapology has him representing China. But I believe Ali Mulatbiyeki is a great prospect that really could be a guy to make a break into the lightweight division in the UFC and represent China doing so. He's 15-2. He's beaten not the best competition in the world, but if he can get past Aziz, he is going to have a lot of success. He actually has beaten good opponents in the past, like a 15-3 Qiqi Yan and a 10-2 Akmalon Muradov. But I think that we're going to see Ali Mulatbiyeki in the UFC one day. He's probably one of the best Chinese prospects in the world right now. And the next one is Dayumisi Zawupasi, who was 7-0. He's also in the Road to UFC tournament. He kind of fights like Khamzat Chimaev. It's kind of crazy, but he's a good wrestler, good offensive grappler. Just dominated in 1 minute Ephraim Ginting in the Road to UFC opening round. I think he potentially could go on to do big things for China in the UFC. Bahati Boli Batibalati is also on the list. I don't rate Bahati Boli Batibalati too highly. He kind of milked a DQ out of Wonbin Key, and unfortunately because he milked the DQ, I don't think he's going to get past the next round, which is Shin Haraguchi. But with that being said, he still is a pretty good Chinese prospect. Maybe if he beats Shin Haraguchi, he really could go on to do something, because I do rate his next opponent in Shin Haraguchi highly, but we'll move on. Wally Huang is 11-0. I believe he might actually be 12-0, because I'm assuming he beat this guy that was 7-7. He has not really beaten the best guys in the world, like, at all. But I think maybe eventually you could test this guy on a Dana White's Contender Series fight or something. He's 22 years old and 12-0, and he's from China. He's like the perfect Chinese up-and-coming prospect. And now we'll move on to Asakurabai Jininensbieki, who's 34 years old, but he's very experienced at 39-11. He did lose in 30 seconds, which is a very unfortunate KO loss to Kyungpyo Kim, which he did have last year in the Road to UFC tournament. But I still do believe maybe you could give this guy another opportunity on Dana White's Contender Series. I mean, that win streak is insane. Once again, not really over the best guys, but he did beat a couple of decent guys on the way. But I think that maybe you could give him another opportunity, maybe at some point. However, he is 34 years old. You would have to give him a little bit of time, but I think maybe you could see Jininensbieki somewhere near the UFC at some point. Long Xiao is a guy that the UFC just really wants to sign for some reason. He's 25-7. He fought on Dana White's Contender Series, lost to Christian Canones, who's now kind of gone on to do good things in the UFC. He's 1-1 in the promotion since he beat Long Xiao. But he was meant to fight on the Road to UFC tournament. He pulled out of that. And then he was meant to fight on a Road to UFC bonus fight, and he pulled out of that. But he did beat Shohei Noze in the first round of the Road to UFC tournament, and now he's going to go on. I think he might be able to make it all the way, potentially, depending on who his next opponent is. But Long Xiao is definitely a guy to keep your eye on. The UFC, for some reason, wants to sign this guy desperately, so keep your eye out for him. Baiyoging Gialiesi is also a pretty good fighter. He's actually coming off a recent loss to Shuya Kamakubo by split decision. And if you go to a split decision to Shuya Kamakubo, you're a good fighter, because Shuya Kamakubo is a great fighter in my opinion. Now, Kamakubo looked horrible in that last matchup, but that was because Baiyoging really actually kind of made him look pretty bad. Like that was Baiyoging's credit. I think Baiyoging's a young guy. I think he's got a lot of potential in the future. I think you really could see Gialiesi maybe make something happen for himself in the UFC at some point in the future. Belal Jean is also a great prospect. Unfortunately, Belal Jean isn't quite as good as I thought he was. He did recently fight at 145 pounds, but he did lose to Keisuke Sasu. And Keisuke Sasu just recently lost as well, and I like Keisuke Sasu. But Belal Jean at one point was 23-3, absolutely insane record, insane win streak, not really over the best competition, as a lot of these Chinese guys do enter tournaments. So they fight in tournaments, and they just kind of fight anybody, if that makes any sense. So that's why a lot of these guys do have really good records, because as I said, the best rise to the top and the worst rise to the bottom. So a lot of these guys don't fight the best competition, but Belal Jean is the guy that did rise to the top. Unfortunately, he did lose to Keisuke Sasu. It was a close fight, but I think with time, maybe Belal Jean, if he gets like 2 more wins, he'll be 25-4. The UFC would have to sign him, right? And we'll move on to the next one. Kong Liu, 13-2. I believe also he's coming off a very unfortunate loss, but I think once again, you give this guy a little bit more time. I think he's quite young. Give him a little bit more time, you can see him in the UFC maybe doing something pretty good for himself in the future. Feiyun Yang, 23-9, very experienced fighter, coming off a good win over Kira Mali. Oh man, it's gonna take a while. Kira Wali, Mai Tahiti, and yeah, he's a pretty good fighter. He did lose to Zayu Mercy Pasu, who I talked about earlier. Lile Du is on this list as well, but once again, he's a good prospect. Maybe he's only 27 years old with so much experience. Maybe you could just give him a Dana White's Contender Series fight to test him, see how good he really is. Aguilai is only 20 years old, and he is 8-1. This guy is someone to keep your eye out, because he's so young. He's only 20 years old. He's 8-1 already. Definitely a guy to maybe just give a little bit of time to. And then Jelly King is 24-10. He's a middleweight. You don't see a lot of Chinese middleweights. A lot of these Chinese guys are lower in weight classes, 24-10. But he's on a good win streak, you know, and the UFC needs middleweights, and the UFC probably wouldn't mind having a Chinese middleweight around, you know what I mean? So he's on a win streak, undefeated since 2019, hasn't beaten very good guys like whatsoever, but maybe he could be worth a try. Qiqi Yan, same sort of situation. She is 23-4, but only 26 years old. Hasn't really beaten the best girl. She did fight Karine Silva, which is a very unfortunate fight to have on the Contender Series. I think Qiqi Yan is so young. She's only 26 years old. you could see her on the Contender Series again at some point, I think, and she's got such a good record. I would be surprised that the UFC just doesn't sign her for her record alone, to be honest. Highlight, Wisamo is only 6-1. She is only 22 years old, and she's also a good Chinese prospect. Just another girl that's super, super young. Maybe a girl to give a little bit more time to. However, as I said, she's only 22 years old and 6-1, so definitely is a lot of time for her to improve. Huaxiang Dong is 10-2, but I believe she probably beat this girl that was only 0-1 recently. But once again, probably a girl that you would have to put on Dana White's Contender Series to test how good she really is. But are only 24 years old and 10-2, pretty good prospect for a female Chinese fighter. And the thing is about just female Chinese fighters, they've got a pretty good record in the UFC, right? So maybe she could be a good prospect in the future. Jijing Wang is 18-5. He has beaten good guys recently. He actually did beat Ting Legi, who was looking at as a prospect. He beat a 4-0 guy recently. And I think he's probably another guy that you could maybe put on Dana White's Contender Series. Test him. How good is he really? Is he as good as his 18-5 record suggests? Lele Du, 26 years old with 48 professional fights. I mean, come on, man. This guy's probably going to have fought like 50 fights if he even makes it into the UFC. He did have a 3-fight losing streak, but he actually avenged one of those losses to Jay Wu. And he has lost this 2 times to the same guy, Xiao Li. But I think if you go down low enough, he's actually got a win over that guy. But with that being said, he's so young and he's had so much experience. It's absolutely insane. So this is definitely a guy to keep your eye out in the future, because you really potentially could see this guy in the UFC in the future. And if you do, you will see that he's fought so many times and he's only 26. It's crazy. Another one is Qiqi Yan Tulosibaki. I definitely butchered that name. I'm so sorry. He has a really bad record, but he's on a really good win streak over good fighters. Ming Ding is a good fighter, and he beat him both, and he beat him twice. He did go on a really bad losing streak, which is unfortunate, but he does have good wins on his record. You know, he beat Makhachev in 2017, and Makhachev is now ranked. He beat Ming Ding twice. He beat a guy that was 9-4, beat a guy that was 5-2. I mean, I'm kind of stretching it a little bit here, but the point is, he's got a lot of experience. 28-17. It's a really ugly record, I do know. But, I mean, he's only 27 years old again. Like, this is a guy with 45 professional fights at the age of 27. That's ridiculous. And another fighter with a lot of experience. 40 pro fights at the age of 28 is Ming Ding. And Ming Ding is a guy that I was just talking about earlier, because he did lose to Qiqi Yan Tulosibaki. However, he's lost to him twice. And I was talking about how good he is. He actually beat Taiyaki Niraji, who should have been on this list, and I completely missed him, who should be signed to the UFC. Unreal that he hasn't been yet, because he absolutely dominated Han Xiao Kim in like one of the most exciting fights I've ever seen in my life. So he should be on this list, but Ming Ding actually has a win over him. So if you give this guy enough time, and if he does beat Qi Wang, and maybe he beats somebody else, Ming Ding could be a guy to put on the radar, you know, maybe a guy that UFC should pick up. Ming Shi is a female Chinese fighter. She is 28 years old. She is 14-5. And she doesn't, again, have the best wins in the world. However, she actually does have a couple of good wins. A 14-4 win here, 10-3 win here. Once again, pretty padded record like a lot of these girls do have. But I think she could be a girl to put on Dana White's Contender Series at some point. Xiao Li is 16-4. Really good prospect. He's a very young guy. Unfortunately, he did lose to this guy called Shimehe Adibileki, who then went on to lose to Shifa Shang, just making Shifa Shang look even better. However, if you do look into Xiao Li, 16-4, actually does have a couple of good wins over Nige Dan, and I believe Nige Dan is like signed to one championship, if I'm not wrong. Like, he's got good wins scattered in between the not so good wins. But yeah, Xiao Li, 16-4, young guy to keep your eye out in my opinion. Qi Wang is 21-11. I was just talking about him because he does have that fight booked against Ming Ding. Once again, a 30-year-old with 32 professional fights. Like, these guys have so much experience, and these guys fight so often. Like, this is why these guys would be perfect to be on the UFC, because the UFC likes people that fight often, the fans like people that fight often, and these guys fight often. They fight all the time. It's crazy. Shimehe Adibileki is on the list as well. He did lose to Shifa Shang recently, but as I said, he did beat Xiao Li, and he has beaten pretty good guys in his career. Another one is Tianfei, who is 11-2. This photo honestly looks AI generated. I don't know if it's actually him or not, but he's 11-2. and on a good win streak. Not really over the best guys in the world, but he's on a good win streak, and I do think maybe eventually you could see him in the UFC as well. Definitely a guy you definitely would have to put on Dana White's Contender Series because he's on a massive win streak. But over who? He hasn't really fought the best guys in the world, but you do actually have to kind of give him a little bit of credit to his losses, because Nige Dan was 14-4 at the time when he beat him when he was 2-1, and he lost to a guy that was 4-2 when he was only 1-0. So, you know, you can kind of give a little bit of thought to those losses, but I think Tian Haofeng is a guy you could see eventually in the UFC. Another one is Zhang Xiao, who's 27-7, 34 pro fights at the age of 28. I mean, it's crazy, right? He did lose to this guy, Ting Lige, recently, who was actually the next fighter on the list that I was going to talk about, who has 48 professional fights at the age of 30. I mean, this is crazy. He did lose recently to Jijing Wang, but I believe I was talking about Jijing Wang recently. You know what I mean. Like, there's a lot of guys coming off losses, which is very unfortunate, but there's so many good Chinese prospects that do have good records. But there's some of them are so experienced, it's insane. But let me know what you think in the comments below about this video. Is there any prospects that I've missed? Is there any Chinese prospects that you want to see in the UFC? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching.